the Azeez Al-Shaair hit on Trevor Lawrence. All right. So Texans Jaguars, Lawrence's first game back in a while. Their season's over. He was kind of questionable coming in, whatever, yada yada. He early in the game, he was playing poorly, slides on a run. Maybe slides a little late. You know, your opinions might differ on the exact physics of what happened in that moment. But Al-Shaair, who's known for being a very hard-hitting player, tackles him head to head. We see the fencing position by Lawrence, very clear right away that he has a head injury. His team comes to defend him. Afterward, the Texans defend Al-Shaair. The NFL suspends him. We don't know about Lawrence's status. Kind of the predictable way that a big, huge hit like that would be handled. But here's where I think our kind of analysis comes in, because none of us are, breaking down X's and O's of football or in locker rooms. Where the media has come out on this, right? And so what interests me about this one is, Ben, you and I talked when the Tua debate came up, right? My take then was the almost infantilization of Tua was a little weird. It was like, we know about concussions now, so here's what you should do, Mr. Tagovailoa, right? It's like, we've learned our lessons, and now, Avantes perfect later, we are ready to tell you how to handle your career. And this kind of felt similar to me. And it feels like we're kind of getting this course correction, this equilibrium on kind of like the hard hits, the brain trauma discussion. And the take that caught my attention the most was from Dominique Foxworth on his podcast, where he said, a hit like this is part of the game. It's within the confines of the rules to try and make your opponent feel pain. It's baked into the game. So if that was a half second earlier, the hit from Al-Shaair, we would have said nothing about it. He went on to say, the problem is, I think the difficult thing is we see guys hit the off switch earlier and earlier than they did in the past, and those things are hard to sort of legislate. Aaron Rodgers said something similar on the Pat McAfee show. Maybe there's something to the fact that those are both players, and maybe this is a player versus media thing here. But I think the more accurate read on it is actually that we're maybe veering a little bit more toward not the furthest, most, I don't mean this in a political way, but like liberal view of these hits and like, let's outlaw them. There's no place for this. The most severe punishments, whatever, maybe where we might have been 7 years ago, to a little more of a realistic take when something like this happens. So that was kind of my read on it. Does it remind you of that Tua discussion, Ben? Am I right there to kind of connect the two?
Yeah, I think there's obviously a natural connection there, especially with the fencing posture making an appearance, which always seems to elevate these stories to kind of a different stratosphere in terms of the news cycle. I was surprised that the reaction, at least the overall reaction I have found, at least today, since the suspension first came out, which it's a 3-game suspension, is that it's too harsh. And so, first of all, in terms of like your Dominique Foxworth take, and fair or not, and I think this is a part of having so many ex-players in the media, when I hear a defensive player defend the defensive player, like my mind just kind of tunes out, because I just think the take is too biased. So if he said something that came out like really strongly against Al-Shaair, then like that would have really caught my attention. But
what about Rodgers? Rodgers would be the guy that's getting his head blown off in that situation, right? I mean,
but who knows what he really thinks about, like, any of that stuff. Yeah. Exactly. So, I mean, he's another one. I'm probably not going to put too much stock into what he says regardless. But I was surprised because I'm so used to my initial reaction was people were going to say this isn't strong enough. And I don't know if like Nick Caserio, the Texans general manager, he came out with a really strong press conference defending him, pointing out he's never been suspended. I think he said he's never been fined, although I don't know if that's right or not.
Even D'Amico Ryans, I mean, again, it's his coach, but even he was like, before they knew what the consequences were, before they had heard any of the spin or anything, he was like, we're standing behind our guy, period.
So I guess I was surprised that it seems so unanimous that this is too harsh, because I'm so used to not only media, especially media, erring on the side of safety, but these things are usually at least debatable, right? Like we usually debate these things, and it just seems like it is a unanimous, like, 3 games was way too much for this. for what was a
Sean,
pretty big hit.
do you think there's something to that? I mean, Ben's kind of pointing out, like, is this just because there's more players in the media, and that's where the equilibrium is coming from? Is that 7 years ago it was just like, the old talking heads kind of trying to find where they should be on this, and now there's players saying, hold on, let's be realistic here.
Yeah. Well, first I want to say, I believe I saw Dan Le Batard also say, this is a game, kind of like what Foxworth was saying. This is a game where people are hurtling towards one another at full speed. Like, these things happen. And I think it kind of speaks to a larger conversation that I think the reason we're seeing such a shift on it, and this is, I could be pulling this out of my ass, but I'm extrapolating just based on listening to this conversation for the last 10, 15 years. That I think there's a larger conversation that we're really not willing to have about football, which is that this is a concussion causing sport. This is an injury causing sport. And so the best way to prevent things like this is to not play football and not support football. We collectively as a society have made it very clear we are not going to do that. We like football, whatever that says and means for us. And I say that as someone who has been a diehard college football fan my whole life and watches football. And so I think there's this dilemma that we have for ourselves. And again, I'm trying not to get too far out over my skis here, but, kind of like, the gun violence conversation and other like heavy conversations about us as a culture. It seems like there was that time period where we started taking concussions very seriously. And there was a lot of people saying the things, I think, Brendon, that you were talking about, where it was like, all right, Tua has to quit for the sake of his career, for the sake of his life. Like, he has to quit. And, this person gets a concussion and like, we have to make changes and we have to outlaw this and we have to change that. And I think we've kind of gotten to the point now where we've seen those kind of cries fall on deaf ears or just don't move. They don't do anything. It's almost weirdly like, well, now we know what it looks like when someone gets a concussion. We understand what's happening. We understand that hit we would have ideally liked it to have happened differently, but football is football and it's happening in, milliseconds, and these things are going to happen. And we're not going to stop playing the game or watching the game because of it. So where's the energy behind having a big critique to it? And again, I don't know if I'm getting like too, I'm extrapolating too much out of this.
I think you're right. I mean, I do think like the awareness of the inherent violence stuff like that I do think is affected by there being more player voices than there were when this conversation maybe hit a fever pitch again, like maybe 5 to 10 years ago, whatever you want to say. People just sort of being able to own the position of like, somebody like Dominic Foxworth, brilliant guy, the idea that he didn't know what he was getting himself into or whatever kind of like insensitive takes you could try to put on football players is not true of him. It's not true of most people. The more of these voices we hear, we're like, no, these guys had every kind of awareness. Chris Long, I think, talks about it very well. And there's a lot of players that kind of weigh in on this stuff that I think do a good job of being like, yeah, we knew what we were getting into. We were fine with it and fingers crossed, right? I've even heard Mike Golick talk about it, and he played before any of this was even, really a conversation. So maybe it's kind of a combination of all of these things, but I've just been kind of fascinated by whether it's Damar Hamlin, Tua, the more and more instances we've had kind of over the past couple of years, there's definitely been a little bit of a change up